The winter of 1876 tore through Wyoming Territory like a vengeful spirit, leaving nothing but ice and misery in its wake. Parker Wilson pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders as he guided his horse through the blinding snowfall, the animal's breath creating ghostly plumes in the frigid air. 3 days of riding through this hellish blizzard had left him questioning his own sanity, but the longing for home kept him moving forward despite the numbness creeping into his limbs. Parker had spent 5 long years building his ranch from nothing but hard work and stubborn determination. At 28, he'd earned every callus on his hands and every silver thread beginning to appear in his dark hair. The cattle drive to Cheyenne had been successful, bringing in enough money to see his ranch through the harsh winter months ahead. But the unexpected early storm had caught him on the return journey, turning what should have been a straightforward ride into a desperate struggle for survival. "Just a little further, Thunder," he murmured to his loyal bay stallion, patting the animal's frost-covered neck. "We'll find shelter soon." The wind howled in response, a mournful sound that seemed to carry whispers of doom. Parker squinted against the stinging snow, trying to make out any landmarks that might guide him. He was reasonably certain he was still on his property, but in this whiteout, he could be miles off course. That's when he saw it, a dark shape against the endless white. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, a common danger in blizzard conditions. But as Thunder cautiously approached, the shape took form. A woman lay half buried in the snow, her body curled tight against the biting cold. Her dress, wholly inadequate for the weather, was torn and frozen in places. Her face, partially visible beneath a tangle of honey-blonde hair, was alarmingly pale with a bluish tint to her lips. "Lord Almighty," Parker breathed, dismounting so quickly he nearly lost his footing in the deep snow. He knelt beside her, pressing his gloved fingers to her neck. A pulse faint but present, with gentle urgency, he brushed the snow from her body. She was young, perhaps 20 or so, and despite her dire condition, he couldn't help but notice her delicate features. "What in God's name was she doing out here alone in this weather, miss? Can you hear me?" Parker called over the wind, but she remained unresponsive. There was no time for questions. Every moment spent in this killing cold decreased her chances of survival. Parker removed his heavy coat and wrapped it around her before carefully lifting her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her body chilled to the bone. As he cradled her against his chest, her eyelids fluttered momentarily, revealing glimpses of startled hazel eyes. "You're safe now," Parker whispered, the promise carrying on his frosted breath. He mounted Thunder with practiced ease despite his burden, settling the woman securely in front of him. The stallion snorted, understanding the urgency without command. Parker knew he had perhaps an hour before his own exposure to the elements became dangerous. The journey to his cabin seemed endless, but Thunder knew the way home better than Parker himself. When the outline of his modest ranch house finally emerged through the curtain of white, relief flooded through him. He'd built the place with his own hands, 2 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a living area centered around a stone fireplace. Nothing fancy, but it was solid and warm, and right now, that was all that mattered. Parker dismounted carefully, keeping the woman secure in his arms. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, the sudden warmth from the banked fire a blessed relief against his wind-burned face. He laid her gently on the buffalo rug before the hearth, then hastened to stoke the fire to full blaze. The woman hadn't stirred during their journey. Up close, in the flickering firelight, Parker could see bruises on her face that had nothing to do with the cold. Someone had hurt her before the blizzard ever had its chance. "What happened to you?" he murmured, though he expected no answer. With efficiency born of years living alone in harsh conditions, Parker gathered what he needed: warm blankets, his medical supplies, and a pot for heating water. The woman's clothes were soaked through and freezing, a death sentence if not addressed. Parker hesitated, propriety warring with necessity. He'd never undressed an unconscious woman before, and the thought made his ears burn despite the emergency. But he knew what frostbite could do. He'd seen good men lose fingers, toes, even entire limbs. "Forgive me, miss," he said to her still form as he began the careful task of removing her frozen garments. He worked with clinical detachment, keeping her covered with blankets as much as possible while changing her into one of his clean flannel shirts and woolen socks. Her skin was mottled with patches of angry red and alarming white, but thankfully, he saw no signs of the black tissue that would indicate severe frostbite. Once she was dry and warmly wrapped in every blanket he owned, Parker prepared a brew of willow bark tea, knowing she would need it for pain when she awoke. If she awoke. He'd done what he could, but he'd seen enough winter tragedies to know that sometimes. The cold took its victims even after they'd been brought in from the storm. As night deepened outside, the blizzard's fury increased. Parker sat vigilant beside the stranger he'd rescued, occasionally bathing her face with warm cloths, checking her pulse and urging her to swallow small amounts of warm broth. Hours passed this way, the cabin creaking under the assault of the wind, the fire crackling steadily. It was near midnight when she finally stirred. A small moan escaped her lips, followed by violent shivering, a good sign, Parker knew. Her body was fighting back, her eyes opened slowly, confusion giving way to panic as she realized she was in an unfamiliar place with a stranger. She tried to sit up, a cry of alarm on her lips. "Easy now," Parker soothed, keeping a respectful distance. "You're safe. I found you in the snow about 5 miles from here. My name is Parker Wilson. This is my ranch." She stared at him with wary eyes, clutching the blankets tightly around herself. "Where are my clothes?" Her voice was hoarse but carried a refined accent that immediately told Parker she wasn't from these parts. "They were soaked through. I had to remove them before frostbite set in." "They're drying by the fire," he explained, gesturing to where her tattered dress and undergarments hung from a makeshift line near the hearth. "I'm sorry for the impropriety, but it was that or let you freeze." She seemed to accept this, though wariness remained in her eyes. After a moment's consideration, she spoke again. Hannah Porter, Miss Porter," Parker acknowledged with a nod. "Can you tell me how you came to be alone in a blizzard?" Hannah's gaze dropped to her hands, which still trembled slightly. "I was traveling on the stagecoach to Fort Laramie. We were attacked by bandits about 10 miles back. They took everything of value and shot the driver when he resisted." Her voice broke. "I ran when they started arguing over what to do with me. I thought I could find help or shelter, but the storm, I got lost." Parker's jaw tightened at her story. Stagecoach robberies weren't uncommon, but they usually didn't occur in such severe weather. These men must have been desperate or simply vicious. "When did this happen?" he asked. "Yesterday morning, I think." Hannah's brow furrowed. "I've lost track of time." "I walked until I couldn't anymore." Parker was impressed despite himself. She'd survived nearly a day and a half in lethal conditions with inadequate clothing. "You're remarkably resilient, Miss Porter." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "My father always said I was too stubborn for my own good." The mention of her father prompted another question. "Where were you headed? Do you have family expecting you?" The smile vanished, replaced by something that looked like grief. "No, my parents died 6 months ago, influenza. I was going to Fort Laramie to take a position as a school teacher." Parker nodded, understanding her situation better. A young woman alone in the world had few respectable options for supporting herself. Teaching was one of the better ones. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly. "When the storm passes, I'll take you to Fort Laramie myself." "But that won't be for a few days at least, from the sound of it." As if to emphasize his point, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows. Hannah glanced toward the sound, a shudder running through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson." "I don't know how to repay your kindness." "No need for that. No decent man would leave another soul to die in the snow," Parker replied, rising to his feet. "You should rest now. The bedroom is yours for as long as you need it. I'll make up a place for myself out here." Hannah looked like she might protest, but exhaustion was clearly overtaking her. With Parker's help, she managed to walk the short distance to the bedroom, her steps unsteady but determined. "There's water in the pitcher if you need it," Parker said, lingering at the doorway. "I'll be just outside if you need anything else." Hannah paused before closing the door. Mr. Wilson, you said you found me in the snow and told me I was safe now. I remember that, I think. It was the last thing I heard before everything went dark. Her voice softened. Thank you for making that true. Parker nodded, suddenly finding himself at a loss for words. Good night, Miss Porter, good night. After the door closed, Parker stood motionless for a moment, struck by the strange turn his day had taken. He'd ridden out this morning a solitary rancher and would sleep tonight as the reluctant host to a mysterious young woman who'd nearly died in his arms. The blizzard continued for 3 days, imprisoning them in the small cabin. Parker quickly established a routine that respected Hannah's privacy while ensuring her recovery. He hunted in the brief periods when the storm abated enough to allow it, bringing back rabbits that Hannah skillfully transformed into stews that far surpassed his own rough cooking. On the third evening, as they sat before the fire sharing a meal, Hannah asked the question Parker had been expecting since she regained her strength. Tell me about your ranch, Mr. Wilson. You seem young to own such a place. Parker smiled slightly, watching the flames dance in the hearth. I came out west when I was 23. Worked as a ranch hand for a few years, saved every penny. When this land came available cheap after the previous owner died without heirs, I jumped at it. It was mostly wild and took 2 years of backbreaking work just to make it livable. And you did it all alone. There was something like admiration in her voice. Parker nodded. Mostly, hired help during roundup times, but the building, the fencing, that was all me. It's impressive, Hannah said sincerely. My father was a banker in Boston. He would have respected a self-made man like you. Parker found himself curious about her life before. Boston's a long way from Wyoming Territory. What made you choose to come all this way for a teaching position? Hannah was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. After my parents died, I discovered that my father's business was deeply in debt. The house, the furnishings, everything was sold to pay the creditors. I had some education and no marriage prospects, so teaching seemed the best option. The position in Fort Laramie was one of the few available to a woman without connections or references. Parker heard what she didn't say, that she'd gone from a life of comfort to one of desperate necessity in the span of months. He'd known hardship himself, but it had been his choice to face the frontier. She'd been forced into it by circumstance. The West can be harsh, he acknowledged, but there's opportunity here for those willing to work for it, and beauty too, though it's hard to see in a blizzard. Hannah smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. I caught glimpses before the storm. It's so vast compared to Boston, overwhelming, but in a way that makes you feel alive. Their conversation continued late into the night, exchanging stories and observations. Parker found himself laughing more than he had in years, drawn to Hannah's quick wit and thoughtful insights. When she finally retired to the bedroom, he remained by the fire, troubled by the awareness that he was beginning to enjoy her company far more than was wise for a temporary arrangement. On the morning of the 4th day, they awoke to silence the blessed absence of howling wind that signaled the storm's end. Parker stepped outside to find a transformed world, brilliant white under a painfully blue sky. The snow lay deep across the land, smooth and untouched except for the tracks of wildlife desperate for food. It's beautiful, Hannah breathed, coming to stand beside him on the porch, wrapped in one of his old coats that dwarfed her slender frame. It is, Parker agreed, though he was looking at her and not the landscape. The cold had brought color to her cheeks, and in the sunlight, her hair showed streaks of gold among the honey tones. The bruises on her face had faded to yellowish shadows that would soon disappear completely. I suppose we can make for Fort Laramie now, she said, though there was a hesitancy in her voice that gave Parker pause. The snow's too deep still, he replied, perhaps too quickly. We should wait another day or two for it to settle and melt some. Traveling now would be dangerous. If Hannah recognized his excuse for what it was, she didn't call him on it. Instead, she nodded, relief briefly visible in her expression. That seems sensible. They spent the day in companionable activity, Parker tending to his livestock, which had weathered the storm in the sturdy barn, and Hannah making the cabin more habitable than it had been in years. She discovered a patch of wild onions somehow still accessible near the house and incorporated them into their dinner, transforming simple fare into something that reminded Parker of home-cooked meals from his childhood. As they sat together that evening, Parker found himself speaking of things he rarely discussed. "I had a brother," he said suddenly, staring into his coffee. "Younger than me by 4 years, Patrick. He wanted to come west with me, but our mother had just died, and he felt obligated to stay with our father in Missouri." Hannah listened quietly, giving him space to continue. "2 years after I left, there was an outbreak of typhoid in their town. They both died within days of each other." Parker's voice remained steady, though the pain was evident in his eyes. "I always wondered if I should have stayed, or if I should have tried harder to convince Patrick to come with me." Hannah reached across the table and placed her hand on his, a gesture so simple yet so profound in its comfort. "You couldn't have known what would happen, and living your life driven by what-ifs is no way to honor their memory." Her words, spoken with gentle certainty, eased something in Parker's chest that had been tight for years. "What about you?" he asked. "Any siblings?" Hannah shook her head. "I was an only child. My mother had several miscarriages before and after I was born. She used to say I was her miracle." Her voice caught slightly. "They wanted me to marry well to secure my future. I think they would be horrified to see me now, homeless and dependent on the kindness of a stranger." "I'm not a stranger anymore," Parker said quietly. Their eyes met across the table, and something shifted in the air between them, an acknowledgement of the connection that had formed during their days of shared isolation. Hannah was the first to look away, a flush coloring her cheeks. "No, I suppose you're not." The following days settled into a rhythm that felt dangerously comfortable to both of them. The snow began to melt, creating paths that would soon be passable, yet neither mentioned Fort Laramie. Instead, they found reasons to delay. Another storm might be coming. The creek would be running too high from snowmelt. Hannah's cough hadn't quite cleared. Parker taught Hannah to ride his gentlest mare, laughing at her initial trepidation and then marveling at how quickly she adapted to the saddle. Hannah, in turn, discovered Parker's small collection of books and began reading aloud in the evenings, her voice bringing new life to stories he'd read countless times. It was during one such evening, 10 days after he'd found her in the snow, that Parker realized he was falling in love with Hannah Porter. She was reading from a volume of Tennyson, the firelight gilding her profile, when she paused and caught him watching her. "What is it?" she asked, a self-conscious smile playing at her lips. Parker could have made an excuse, but something in her eyes encouraged honesty. "I was thinking that I've never met anyone quite like you before." Hannah marked her place in the book and set it aside. "Is that a compliment, Mr. Wilson?" "Parker," he corrected gently. "And yes, it most definitely is." She looked down at her hands, but not before he caught the pleased expression that crossed her face. "I've been thinking that I should probably continue to Fort Laramie soon. I've imposed on your hospitality far too long." The words were expected, but they still struck Parker like a physical blow. "You're not imposing. Having you here has been. It's been good, Hannah." She met his gaze again, her eyes searching his face. "For me as well, better than I could have imagined. But I have no claim on this place, on this life. I came west to be a teacher, and that's what I should do." Parker stood and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "What if you had another option?" Hannah's breath caught, her fingers tightening around his. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that these past days have shown me what my life could be like with you in it. I'm saying that the thought of you leaving makes me realize how empty this place will seem without you." Parker took a deep breath. "I know it's sudden, and I know you hardly know me, but I'm asking if you might consider staying, not as a guest, but as..." "As what?" Hannah whispered, though her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. "As my wife, eventually. If you could come to feel for me what I'm beginning to feel for you." Hannah's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't pull away. "Parker, I've lost everything I ever knew. I came west because I had nowhere else to go. How can you be sure I'm not just grasping at security?" "Because I've seen your strength," Parker replied without hesitation. "You survived conditions that would have killed most men, let alone a city-raised woman. You could make a life for yourself anywhere you chose. I'm just asking you to choose here. With me." Hannah was quiet for a long moment, emotions playing across her expressive face. "I would need time," she finally said. "Not to decide if I want to stay, I already know I do, but to be sure that what's growing between us is real and not just born of extraordinary circumstances." Parker felt hope surge through him. "Time is something I can offer. Stay through the spring, help me with the calving season, see what ranch life is truly like before you commit to it. If by summer you want to continue to Fort Laramie, I'll take you there myself. And if I want to stay—" "Then nothing in this world would make me happier," Parker said simply. Hannah leaned forward slowly and pressed her lips to his, a kiss as gentle as a whisper but filled with promise. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with certainty. "Then I'll stay, at least until summer." Spring arrived with a vengeance, turning the frozen landscape into a riot of mud and new growth. Hannah proved remarkably adaptable to ranch life, throwing herself into learning every aspect with enthusiasm that impressed even Parker's most skeptical neighboring ranchers. She developed a particular affinity for the horses, especially a pregnant mare that delivered a difficult foal under Hannah's patient care. Parker found her one morning in the barn, asleep against the stall door, the newborn foal's head resting in her lap. "You're a natural," he told her when she blinked awake, embarrassed to be caught in such a state. "Hardly," she laughed, carefully extracting herself without disturbing the foal. "But I'm learning. It feels good to be useful." As the land thawed and greened, so too did their relationship bloom. Parker discovered Hannah's passion for education extended beyond the classroom. She taught him about literature and history during their evening conversations, while he showed her the ways of the land during daylight hours. They complemented each other in ways neither had anticipated. There were challenges, of course. Hannah struggled with the isolation, having grown up in a bustling city. Parker sometimes retreated into silence when overwhelmed, a habit from years of solitude that frustrated Hannah's more communicative nature. But they learned to navigate these differences with growing understanding. By early May, the ranch was transformed by Hannah's influence. Curtains adorned windows that had been bare for years. Wildflowers appeared in jars throughout the house. And most significantly, a small plot behind the cabin had been turned into a vegetable garden under Hannah's determined care. "This is permanent," Parker observed one evening as they stood surveying her gardening efforts. "These won't yield until late summer." Hannah's hand found his, fingers intertwining naturally. "I suppose I'm putting down roots, quite literally." The double meaning wasn't lost on Parker. "Does that mean you've made your decision about staying?" Hannah turned to face him fully, her expression serious but tender. "I think I made my decision the moment you found me in that snowfield. I just needed time to recognize it." Parker's heart thundered in his chest. "And what decision is that?" "That home isn't a place. It's where you feel safe, respected, and loved." Hannah stepped closer. "You make me feel all those things, Parker Wilson." He gathered her into his arms, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. "I love you, Hannah Porter. Have since before I even knew your name, I think." "That's rather impressive," she teased, her eyes bright with happiness, "considering I was half frozen and unconscious when we met." Parker laughed, pressing his forehead to hers. "What can I say? You made quite an impression." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony performed by the circuit preacher who happened through the area. The neighboring ranchers and their families attended, curious about the Boston woman who had tamed not only Parker Wilson, but also his previously chaotic home. Hannah wore a dress of pale blue calico that she'd sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Parker, unaccustomed to formal attire, nevertheless donned his best shirt and a new vest that Hannah had insisted on ordering from the mercantile in the nearest town. "You look like a gentleman rancher," she told him approvingly as they prepared to greet their guests. "And you look like a dream I never dared to have," he replied, the sincerity in his voice making her blush like a girl half her age. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music from a neighbor's fiddle and more food than Parker's small ranch had ever seen. As the last guests departed, Parker and Hannah stood on their porch, arms around each other, watching the sunset paint the vast Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson. Any regrets? Parker asked softly, still sometimes finding it hard to believe that this remarkable woman had chosen a life with him. Hannah shook her head, leaning into his embrace. Only that we didn't meet sooner, although, she added thoughtfully, perhaps we met exactly when we were supposed to. In a field of snow, Parker murmured, remembering the sight of her half-buried form that had forever changed his life, where you lifted me up and whispered that I was safe. Hannah turned in his arms to face him, and I've felt safe every day since. As darkness settled over the land they now shared, Parker Wilson led his bride into their home, grateful beyond words for the blizzard that had brought her to him, and for whatever providence had guided him to that precise spot on that winter day. 2 years later, in the spring of 1878, Hannah sat on the same porch, watching as Parker demonstrated rope techniques to their 1-year-old son, who giggled delightedly from his perch on his father's knee. The ranch had prospered under their joint care, expanding to include more cattle and a small but growing horse breeding operation centered around the mare and foal that Hannah had helped deliver her first spring there. "He's going to be a rancher like his father," Parker declared proudly as the boy grabbed at the rope with pudgy hands. "Perhaps," Hannah agreed, her hand resting protectively over the slight swell of her belly where their second child grew, "or perhaps a scholar like his mother. He'll have the freedom to choose his own path." Parker smiled at his wife, still sometimes struck by how fortunate he'd been to find her that fateful winter day. "As long as that path eventually leads him home again." Hannah reached out to take his hand, her wedding ring catching the late afternoon sunlight. "Home," she repeated softly. "Who would have thought I'd find it in a blizzard?" "Some treasures are hidden until exactly the right moment," Parker replied, squeezing her hand gently. "And some are worth braving any storm to find." As the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the land they'd built together, Parker and Hannah Wilson sat contentedly with their son between them, a family forged in snow and strengthened by love, as enduring as the frontier that had brought them together.